If I was a betting man, which I am not, I would not put any money on the United States based on what we've seen over the past 15 years in terms of ramping up their ability to build supply chains that would rival China's, not only in the extraction of critical minerals, but also in the refining of critical minerals. And remember, there are no major refining facilities in the United States anywhere near on par of what they have in China for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and all of these different battery metals. The amount of investment that the Americans would have to make to be able to pull these supply chains away from China, both in China and in places like Africa, the Americas, and elsewhere, would be on a Marshall Plan scale. And there is no indication whatsoever that either the Congress or Trump wants to do that.
There would be a degree of continuity from where the Biden administration is going to leave off. And there's always been continuity and bipartisan consensus. The key sticking point at the moment is the renewal of AGOA, which is still pending and which consensus has basically been broken, right? And that's the reason why AGOA could not pass by the end of last year. So that's a point to watch. However, even if AGOA is not passed, I think it provides an opportunity to rethink Africa and US engagements. So there's an opportunity really to rethink, reset, and recalibrate U.S. relations with Africa.
The U.S. will support the country's growth through investments and diplomacy, but continued alignment with China, Russia, Iran, and Hamas will bring swift consequences. If the government persists with its reckless foreign policy, Mr. Trump should consider slashing American trade benefits, isolating Pretoria diplomatically, and imposing sanctions against ANC leaders that ally with America's adversaries and engage in corruption.
People are really so panicked about China, for example, having this leadership in, say, pharmaceuticals, right? The US has big pharmaceutical companies. What's holding them back? Same with the auto industry, same with green energy, same with all of the other things that China is producing. The US is a huge, powerful country. How is China holding them back from these things if they wanted to really, to have them?
The key question for me would be how the United States, with an America First policy, intends to engage to be able to advance its economic agenda as opposed to that being proposed by China. At a time when, if you look at the trade figures, China overlapped the United States by close to $1 trillion in trade last year alone in exports. So, as Marco Rubio says, within the next 10 years, if things keep going in the way they are going, then we would basically have China as the main economic player globally.
The China in Africa podcast is supported in part by our subscribers and Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join a global community of readers for daily news and exclusive analysis about Chinese engagement in Asia, Africa, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we're going to pick up the conversation that we started earlier this week, talking about the impact of the incoming Trump administration on the Global South. And today we're going to focus specifically on Africa. And we have a lot of material to work with this week, in part because of all the Senate confirmations that are going on with the President-elect Trump's proposed cabinet. And so we had earlier in the week Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary. And again, we played some sound bites from that earlier in our Global South program. But today we're going to focus on Marco Rubio, who is tapped to be Secretary of State. Marco Rubio, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the senator from Florida, and he is a longtime Washington, D.C. insider, comes with a very, very deep background in foreign affairs as well, very well liked on both sides of the aisle. Interesting, Cobus, that the hearings for Marco Rubio had a very different tone this week than the other cabinet members, in part because the partisanship that we've seen in other hearings wasn't there in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where both Democrats and Republicans were very effusive in their praise of Marco Rubio. But I think, Cobus, what it does is it puts into focus, and it's really a great opportunity for us to be able to kind of pull back the veil of U.S. politics, and we get for 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours this uninterrupted flow of discourse coming from both lawmakers and, in this case, a future Secretary of State, to hear them lay out everything that they want to do. And I think for a lot of people who don't follow U.S. politics very closely, it can be somewhat jarring. And we're going to play today sound bites and outtakes from Rubio's hearing, both from the senators and from Rubio himself. And we have this special opportunity today with our guest and with you for you to respond to them and to hear how acidic the discourse is in Washington about China in particular, and then how they are framing Africa. And I think you're going to be, maybe you might be a little bit jaded, but other people might be surprised by the tone.
Yep, no, I'm into it. Let's hear.
Okay, nothing much to say on that one, but let's get started. We're going to bring in our guest because I want to start rolling these sound bites. And I'm thrilled to have on the show for the first time Fonteh Akum, who is the executive director of the Institute for Security Studies, which is one of South Africa's premier foreign policy think tanks. Normally, Fonteh is based in Pretoria in South Africa, but today joining us bright and early from Washington, D.C., where all this action is happening. A very good morning to you, Fonteh.
Good morning, Eric. It's a pleasure to join both you and Cobus for this conversation.
Oh, it's great. And we're so excited to have you, especially for the fact that you're in Washington. We'd love to hear a little bit about what you are doing in Washington, what the mood is, and how you're thinking about this incoming Trump administration. So maybe we'll just, before we get to the sound bites, give us your take on what impact you think the new Trump administration is going to have on foreign policy for Africa. And then how does China fit into all of this? Because the U.S. and China seem to bounce off each other when it comes to Africa.
Well, I think we are going through a time of uncertainty, and the Trump administration does not ease any of that uncertainty or provide any certainty to the global picture. Given the fact that if you look at their foreign policy priorities as outlined by Trump himself already, darting from an interest in Greenland to talking about what wildfires in California. However, engagement in Africa would largely be built on about 3 or 4 pillars. The first pillar would likely be a security cooperation pillar, where it would be useful, I think, for both the Trump administration and their African partners to rethink security cooperation within a changing global and geopolitical context. The second one would be more on the transactional front, with the African Growth and Opportunities Act up for renewal, and to see exactly how economic cooperation between the U.S. and Africa goes forward. And Africa as well, speaking of Africa in its most diverse sense. The third preoccupation would be the development angle, looking at issues of science, tech, chips, and cars, which is the crux of the trade conversation and the apex of the trade war between China and the US. And Africa would certainly play a role in that conversation as well. So there are opportunities. There are lots of challenges. We would need to understand exactly to what extent the Trump administration prioritizes Africa as well. So those are some of the conversations that are taking place right now. The outgoing administration is in its last legs, and there are a lot of questions. I think there is also a bit of reassurance from the emerging Africa team that's going to take over at both the National Security Council and at the level of Secretary of State for African Affairs.
I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. Like, what kinds of kind of appointments do you see coming in the Africa team, and how might that shape engagement?
Word on the street is that Dr. Peter Pham from the Atlantic Council would be a shoe-in.
I knew it. I knew it. I called that one. Peter Pham is a guy who, for the past
You called it like the full 3 years ago.
Exactly. And Peter Pham is a guy who woke up every morning and said, "Good morning, Mr. Assistant Secretary of State. How are you?" when he looked in the mirror. I mean, he has been gunning for this job for a long time. But okay, and again, not confirmed. This has not been confirmed yet, but this is the word on the street. Anybody else that you have any insights on, or even the kinds of people that they're going to appoint?
Well, I mean, it's looking like for the National Security Council, they'll be going to an old Africa hand from the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, particularly working on Africa. So a lot of reassurances there as well, who has quite some background in the environmental space. So very interesting choice, which raises a number of important questions, right? What would be the prioritization of Africa within this particular administration? We know exactly what it was like during Trump 1. And the second is what resources would actually be deployed to engage in the foreign policy space, particularly if you are going to set an agenda that seeks to counter China's influence on the African continent.
And Peter Pham will be the perfect person to do that. He is very much part of the China hawk community in Washington. If you just follow his X feed, there's lots of critical posts and critical comments about what the Chinese are doing in Africa. But Fonteh, you've raised a number of key issues that we might actually get some insights from listening to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and to Marco Rubio himself. Let me start our discussion today just to set the tone as it was laid out by Republican Senator Jim Risch, who is the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee overseeing the hearings with Marco Rubio. And I'm starting on a quote that he laid out about China. And again, I just want everybody to listen to the tone and the seriousness that how this committee started its discussion with Senator Marco Rubio.
China remains the most significant long-term risk to the United States. The Chinese government steals American intellectual property, floods our streets with fentanyl, and exploits our free markets for its own gain while aggressively undermining American national security. China is no longer satisfied to undermine the United States on its own. Now it helps Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Chinese support has enabled Russia to carry on its illegal war against Ukraine, and China's massive purchases of Iranian oil are a lifeline to that murderous regime's proxy wars. The outgoing administration's failure to push back on China's aggression means that China is challenging America everywhere, from Africa to our hemisphere in Latin America. Senator Rubio has been a strong advocate of tougher policies to counter China's aggression, and particularly in Latin America. In the Middle East, Israel fights a multi-front war against Iran after the brutal attack on October 7th. Yet the outgoing administration has undermined support to Israel. This has only prolonged the terrible situation in Israel and Gaza. In spite of the outgoing administration's policy, Israel's fortitude has brought Tehran to its weakest point in decades. President Trump and Marco both know that we need to support our ally and return to a maximum pressure campaign against Iran. At the same time, Putin, with the support of the CCP, continues his violent assault on Ukraine. Putin has escalated this war over and over again, most recently by importing thousands of North Korean soldiers. I've said repeatedly since the beginning of 2022 full-scale invasion, we need to help Ukraine end this war quickly and permanently. I'm confident that if anyone can end this war, it's President Trump. And Marco is the right man to help ensure it is done in a way that guarantees security and stability for Ukraine, the U.S., and our allies, and prevents Russia from launching another war. Unfortunately, the threats to American interests don't end there. A genocide in Sudan, a much-needed but still uncertain regime change in Syria, human rights abuses, human trafficking. The list of challenges facing America is long. And because of that, we must rein in and enforce accountability at the United Nations, whose agenda and wasteful practices frequently do not align with those of the United States. In Asia, it will be important to work with our allies in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines to boost their military spending and bolster their ability to deter China. We should work with Australia and the United Kingdom as part of the AUKUS agreement to develop and advance military capabilities to counter Chinese coercion in the Indo-Pacific. And I hope the State Department will acknowledge the nuclear arms race our adversaries are pursuing and make the changes needed to confront this new reality.
Fonteh, that is the view from the House or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. When you hear that litany of issues, the way they've been set out and the table's been set by Senator Risch, tell us your response. What were you thinking about when you were listening to that?
The first is the interpretive lens through which Senator Risch looks at China's role in hotspots is rather problematic for a number of reasons. The first is it does not actually look at the nuanced engagement of China across different spaces, the diplomatic space, the business space, and within the framework of its ambitions as a global economic player. That's a first. The second is they clearly should be pursuing U.S. interest. But to pursue those interests, there's the need to make certain investments, but also the necessity to build the kinds of alliances and partnerships that allow the U.S. to actually promote its own agenda globally as well. However, I think it would be worth looking at what China has laid out as a strategic vision, right, through the Global Security Initiative, through the Global Civilizational Initiative as well, and through the Global Development Initiative. These are initiatives that China has put out to say...
But the Americans don't respect that. You wouldn't expect Senator Risch to say, let's take a closer look at the Global Security Initiative, would you?
I wouldn't expect him to say that, but I would expect him to work with an understanding of what China's offer is and for the U.S. to come with a counter offer rather than simply opposing that which China offers.
Yeah. Cobus, let's get your take on how Senator Risch sees the world and framed it. And I think, by the way, Senator Risch's worldview is quite common in Washington. So this is probably a widely held perception of world affairs today as seen from D.C. What's your take, Cobus?
Yes, I agree. Like, none of what he said was particularly a surprise to me because that is how it's framed, right? Kind of like how all of these different conflicts and problems are framed in DC. You know, what was striking for me, and I think I overlap with Fonteh a little bit here, is what was revealing for me is how he was framing things similarly to how one would think of the villain in a James Bond movie, right? Kind of like in the sense that the only thing that the villain wants is to defeat the hero. The only agenda that the villain has is to defeat the hero. The villain doesn't have an independent existence, right? And there's a similar kind of aspect there where there seems to be like indifference to what countries like China actually want. You know, like rather there's a kind of a fantasy of that the only thing that China is interested in is destroying the US rather than, you know, say domestic issues, but then also a kind of a disinterest in what other countries want. And, you know, and particularly kind of what countries in the global south really need, and which obviously creates a reason for them to work with China. And partly I think that is because it's a kind of a self-flattering way of looking at the world, because otherwise one would have to admit that a lot of what these global south countries need, America can't really provide, or more specifically isn't interested in providing. So, you know.
But what you're going to hear in the comments today from Senator Rubio are, they don't care. It's not about what the global south countries want. It's about what meets U.S. priorities.
Exactly.
And let's stay with China for just a little bit more before we get to Africa, because, again, this China piece is going to be a foundational piece of the Africa part of the discussion. So very quickly into the conversation between Rubio and the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, China came up, and Nebraska Senator Pete Ricketts, also Republican, asked Rubio to lay out how he sees the threat posed by China to the United States.
Do you agree that the PRC is the biggest threat that we face as the United States?
The Communist Party of China that leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin. There's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places. But the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went. And I think you're alluding to it in your statement. I know you may have another question. I don't want to eat up all your time, but I do want to say this. The Chinese believe that the United States are a great power in inevitable decline and that they are an inevitable rise. Now, they already are. They're going to be a rich and powerful country, and we're going to have to deal with them. The danger is that because of our own actions, in many cases, a dangerous imbalance is built up in that relationship. We allowed them for years to pretend that they were some developing country, so we should allow them to continue to cheat on trade and commerce. We should allow them to continue to expand. They lied about not militarizing and populating island chains in the South China Sea and the like. We allowed them for years, before we got serious about it, to conduct grotesque human rights violations against Uyghur Muslims, as an example. One of the most horrifying things happening on the planet. And for years, no one talked about it, which, by the way, not just has a human rights component to it, it allows them to use slave labor to produce goods that, at the expense of the rest of the world. Talk about not just a horrific humanitarian crisis, but an unfair trade practice as well. We've allowed them to get away with things. And frankly, the Chinese did what any country in the world would do given these opportunities. They took advantage of it. And so I think now we're dealing with the ramifications of it. I agree 100% what you said, but I remind you, and I remind everyone, I guess I want to make this point, that much of what we need to do to confront China is here at home. It's not just abroad, it's also here at home. We have to rebuild our domestic industrial capacity, and we have to make sure that the United States is not reliant on any single other nation for any of our critical supply chains.
And with 4 seconds left, how are you going to explain that to your average American, that we need this all-size society approach? And your point exactly, that it needs to begin here at home, and so that people from my state, Nebraska, will understand and get on board.
If we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not. Everything from the blood pressure medicine we take to what movies we get to watch, and everything in between, we will depend on China for it. They have come to dominate the critical mineral industry supplies throughout the world. Everywhere in the world, they've now established critical mineral rights. Even those who want to see more electric cars, no matter where you make them, those batteries are almost entirely dependent on the ability of the Chinese and the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to produce it and export it to you. So if we don't change course, we are going to live in a world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. That's an unacceptable outcome.
And this brings us right to the doorstep of South Africa. Those critical minerals that Rubio was talking about, a lot of them pass through South Africa or actually come to South Africa. And Fonteh, this is the key issue here now. He's laid it out. No other country in the world presents a challenge to the United States like China. China will be a battle for the United States, and most likely they're going to bring this rhetoric to their engagement in Africa. Again, let's hear your take on how he's framing China. And if Africa wants to be relevant in the policy discourse in the United States, it feels like China is going to be part of that conversation.
No, absolutely. Senator Rubio's assessment is sobering. It's clear, and it identifies exactly where the pressure points are in the United States at the moment. And I think there is bipartisan consensus around the way China is perceived. In terms of critical raw minerals, though, the U.S. does not seem to have done enough to actually not only promote partnerships that foster effective extraction and socially responsible extraction on the continent. But outside of the Lobito corridor, the U.S. cannot really invest in the kinds of infrastructure that's needed, first of all, to transform those resources on the continent, but more importantly, to ensure that they feed into U.S. supply chains as an alternative to the Chinese supply chains which exist at the moment. So it's a tall order, right? The U.S. would have to engage on the diplomatic front more actively. The U.S. would have to reinvest in a global system. However, the key question for me would be how the United States, with an America First policy, intends to engage to be able to advance its economic agenda as opposed to that being proposed by China. At a time when, if you look at the trade figures, I mean, China overlapped the United States by close to $1 trillion in trade last year alone, in exports last year alone. And so, as Marco Rubio says, within the next 10 years, if things keep going in the way they are going, then we would basically have China as the main economic player globally. The second thing I would say is the U.S., it's easy to look at the U.S. alone, but the U.S. already belongs to sort of this global north axis of engagement as well, the U.S., Europe, and all of that. And the U.S. would need to look at its transatlantic engagements as part of its sort of relationship with China. In Europe, they speak of strategic autonomy, what does that exactly mean in terms of relationships with China as well? I think there are a lot more questions than answers, and it requires a net investment in foreign policy and diplomacy, which does not necessarily align with where an austere Trump administration would be going.
Cobus, if he says 10 years is the deadline, you and I have been in this space for 15 years now doing this. If I was a betting man, which I am not, I would not put any money on the United States based on what we've seen over the past 15 years in terms of ramping up their ability to build supply chains that would rival China's, not only in the extraction of critical minerals, but also in the refining of critical minerals. And remember, there are no major refining facilities in the United States anywhere near on par of what they have in China for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and all of these different battery metals. The amount of investment that the Americans would have to make to be able to pull these supply chains away from China, both in China and in places like Africa, the Americas, and elsewhere, would be on a Marshall Plan scale. And there is no indication whatsoever that either the Congress or Trump wants to do that. So when you hear Rubio say 10 years or else China will control these vital industries, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I had to laugh a little bit. I was like thinking like, oh, no, not taking grandpa's heart medicine, So it's, it's interesting. Like, as you say, like the US hasn't fully gotten all the way to refining critical minerals. They haven't really kind of been able to secure supply chains in Africa. The US has significant critical mineral reserves of their own, which are also not really being marshaled. I think part of what I think is tough here, and I think this is kind of like tough, I think, for external observers of the US, is on the one hand, there is this kind of 3-alarm fire kind of tone that is being put on, for example, critical minerals in this case. At the same time, we also know that the US auto industry itself isn't necessarily the most on board with electric cars, right? Kind of they're not kind of jumping to try and kind of out BYD. So the system is so big and so complex, and there's so much kind of inertia and different kind of interests in the system that the US system can sometimes pull in lots of different directions at once. But then the language is, kind of goes all the way up to 11, like very, very quickly. So that was kind of roughly what I was thinking. Is like, if people are really so panicked about China, for example, having this leadership in, say, pharmaceuticals, right? Kind of, then, the US has big pharmaceutical companies. What's holding them back? Same with the auto industry, same with green energy, same with all of the other things that China is producing. The US is a huge, powerful country. Like, how is China holding them back from these things if they wanted to really, to have them?
They have a pretty detailed argument to respond to that, though. They will say overcapacity. They will tell you that state-backed financing. They will tell you about cheating. And remember that Rubio, one of his big takeaways from this hearing was the fact that China lied and cheated its way into superpower status. So they do have a response for you on that question.
Sure, but at the same time, I was also laughing a little bit at that line because it's like, oh yes, the 100,000 kilometers of high-speed rail that China built was somehow just an illusion. They just cheated their way into that. But again, as you frequently say, there's no crying in baseball, right? Kind of, if the US wanted this stuff, then they could have it. Considering how lying and cheating and stealing China is, then if China stole all this technology from the US, then the US still has that technology, right? Kind of, they could just roll it out at scale. They could roll it out at scale and make it cheaper than China if they wanted to, but they don't.
And let's not forget that a quote from our old friend Jude Moore, who used to be with the Center for Global Development in Washington, anytime that Americans would say, well, we can't go dollar for dollar against the Chinese because we just don't have that money, he likes to remind people that the United States could have built 2 or 3 Belt and Roads if they allocated the money that they spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to development. And so trillions of dollars were spent on these wars. The Chinese spent close to $1 trillion on the Belt and Road. Again, it's not because the United States doesn't have the money. It's just how they are using those funds. Let's now move into the Africa discussion. And gentlemen, I am very excited to get your feedback on this because this is right up your alleys. Cobus, I'm going to start with you on this one because I know your passion project when you talk about norm setting. And Senator Chris Coons, who's a Democrat from Delaware, who, by the way, is very active in U.S. foreign policy in Africa, particularly on DRC issues and South Africa issues as well. So he takes Africa very seriously. He asked about multilateral organizations and the role of norm setting.
Multilateral organizations concern and frustrate many of us. Some of their actions have been counter to American interest. But when we've withdrawn from multilateral organizations, and in particular some UN entities, it's also given an opening to our adversaries. The previous Trump administration withdrew from UNESCO, the Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization. And I'm concerned that if we do so without thinking through the consequences, we may abandon our chance to implement our agenda around human rights, around 5G standards, around technical standards that matter for the 21st century. Do you support sustained U.S. participation in multilateral organizations? And how will you work to strengthen our leadership in those institutions in ways that prevent our adversaries from advancing their competing agendas?
Well, I want to point back to what I said at the opening, and that is our engagement in any international agreement or any international arrangement or any international organization has to be driven by the answer to one of three questions. Will our involvement in this organization make us safer, make us more prosperous, make us more secure? It has to be justified by an American interest. It just does. I mean, we're in an era where we need to really, it should have always been that way, but now more than ever. And so each of these will have different components to it. I think there's a second component of funding, and that is, should the United States be funding organizations who in many cases are pursuing and or achieving outcomes that are contrary to the national interest of the United States? Each of these will require a serious examination as we work through them, and a justification to Congress about why we're no longer funding it or we're no longer participating. I think you do point to one that I can tell you right now is one that will be critical for us to be engaged in, and that is the setting of standards. But the setting of standards, for people to understand, is it's not simply from these organizations, it also becomes practical. So throughout Africa, we are now seeing the deployment of these safe city programs by Huawei. Now, this isn't just a commercial deal for Huawei. This is the ability to ingrain itself in the telecommunication of these countries and establish itself as the leader in 5G. And now all of the other technologies that depend on 5G, additive manufacturing, the 3D printing and so forth, autonomous vehicles, they will all have to be drawn to the standards set by Huawei. That's not because an international organization set it up. It's because they've established market dominance, and it's a concern we have in multiple parts of the global south and the developing world. We need to be engaged that way as well.
Cobus, it seems like Senator Rubio is a subscriber to our newsletter and has been reading what you've been writing about in terms of norm setting and standards. It's on the agenda. There it is right there for you.
It is interesting that you raised it. Both the question and the answer is interesting for me from from the perspective of Trump 1.0, which was very focused on or frequently enjoyed a kind of big gesture of pulling out some of these kind of multilateral organizations. The issue, though, I think that everyone is basically sidestepping is the real challenge facing these organizations are that they, in lots of ways, not fit for purpose for the development roles that they're supposed to fulfill. And, development financing is a key one. So that kind of reform, and particularly kind of increasing their power to actually help the developing world, would be key to their success. But that is not necessarily the same agenda I think Senator Rubio is talking about. And in relation to just 5G issues, sure, bring it on. I think Africa would be very happy for kind of competing 5G offers. They're just not coming. They're not coming from the US, certainly.
And by the way, for the record right now, as far as I know, the United States still does not have a 5G alternative to Huawei. And by the way, we're now starting into the 6G era. And as far as I know, I'm trying to look for this, there's no development of a US-based 6G solution either. So again, that 10-year deadline that Rubio's talking about is going to come up pretty quickly. Fonteh, when we talk about multilateral organizations, and you heard the skepticism that the senator was expressing, that they don't always align with American interest, this is very interesting from an African point of view because African countries rely more on these multilateral organizations, whether it's UN agencies, the World Bank, and so forth, more than many other regions around the world. This concern that the United States has about whether multilateral organizations fit within its foreign policy is interesting to me, one, because the U.S. up until now was the guardian of the so-called rules-based international order. These institutions are very much the implementation of that rules-based international order. So to hear the selective desire to engage with these international institutions is interesting, but also it does put African countries at risk if they withhold funding, say from the World Health Organization, for example. When you hear this doubt about multilateral organizations and the role that adversaries, that I'm using my rabbit ear air quotes right now, adversaries, that's French for China, that's China. They're not talking about, Malta. They're talking about China. So give us your take on that exchange that we just heard.
Well, on multilateral organizations, there are three trends that remain very important. The first is changing global power dynamics, right? So multilateral organizations cannot just reflect U.S. interests. They are the product of a negotiated set of interests, right? And negotiation is a fundamental part of multilateral organizations. The second is the rise of a number of non-traditional players in the global system. You have the Gulf countries, you have Turkey, you have India as well. And the rise of these actors is basically shifting global geopolitics with implications for the way in which multilateral organizations are structured and the way they function. The third factor is from the African perspective and mainly from the global south writ large, multilateral organizations are not built for purpose. And I think that would align quite a bit with Marco Rubio's assessment. They're not built for purpose historically because they were built in an era when many African countries were not independent. They're not built for purpose because they're not representative and inclusive enough. And they're not built for purpose because they do not reflect shared yet differentiated responsibility. Now, how the US positions on this would be crucial. At a time when, if you look east, China is taking a claim to advancing security, stability, development in the global south. It's not to say that China is going to pursue this agenda unilaterally because India also is rising and has an alternative offer. I think the obsession with multilateral organizations should actually focus towards reforming these organizations to ensure that they are useful for the majority of people who live on this planet.
Do you think that the United States, as the incumbent power and the kind of the hegemon in this system, will be open to that? It doesn't sound like it, especially in this current administration or the incoming administration.
The United States cannot be open to it, but I feel that ship has sailed, right? Because the challenges that we face globally, from pandemics to the climate crisis, necessitate multilateral action. I'm looking at the issue of the regulation of AI. We just heard them refer to setting standards and norms. There's the need for standards and norms there as well. And it's not going to come from one country dictating to the world exactly how to dance. So multilateral organizations are going to be crucial. Now, whether they would need to redefine the role that the US plays in the multilateral system, but going insular, I'm afraid, would not respond to the pace of globalization and the way in which multilateral organizations are called to play different roles within a changing global context.
Okay. Let's move on to a different topic. This is another issue that came up. A lot of concern in Washington about Chinese and Russian misinformation. And by the way, you're going to hear the pairing of Russia and China in the context of Africa, but in many parts of the world together. And that does seem to be a thing that they do in Washington, that they equate the two, even though the agenda of the Russians and the agenda of the Chinese very different in Africa, but in the rhetoric in Washington, no different. They are the adversaries of the United States, and they often get lumped together. Let's take a listen now to an exchange between Rubio and Senator Chris Murphy, who's a Democratic senator from Connecticut, about the role of Chinese misinformation in places like Africa.
Senator Rubio, in the time I have remaining, just want to tackle two other topics. One that I know is of mutual concern to you and I, and that's the need to confront China in non-military ways as they try to exert influence around the world. Last time President Trump was in office, he was calling for pretty massive cuts to the State Department's budget. But as you know, China uses all sorts of non-kinetic tools like misinformation, economic diplomacy around the world to exert influence. I'm hopeful that you're going to be an active voice to try to make sure that you have the tools, including when it comes to combating Russian and Chinese misinformation, to be able to confront all of the ways, many of them asymmetric, that China in particular, but Russia as well, presents challenges to U.S. interests. Just wanted to get your commitment to make sure to build that full, comprehensive foreign policy toolkit.
Yeah, not only have I been someone concerned about foreign disinformation, I've been the target of it from multiple nation states. And I've learned over time that the best way to confront disinformation is through a flood of free speech that allows the counterpoints of view to be heard and understood. I think where we get ourselves into trouble, and we've learned this now, and I think multiple U.S. companies are now admitting, is when we get ourselves into a position of determining what's true and what's not, and then using the tools of government to go after that, particularly when it implicates domestic entities. But yes, it is one of the tools that they have in their toolbox. By the way, it's not just disinformation. It's flat out influencing nation states' views of the United States writ large by promoting conspiracy theories internally in other countries that undermine us and that undermine our standing, whether it's in Africa, and increasingly you see it in the Western Hemisphere as well. And one of the best ways to combat that is to be present, to be there, to show what we do, and to brag about what we do. One of the things that frustrates me the most is there are literally programs within the USAID where they do not allow us to label it as made in America or a gift of the American people because it might offend someone locally. I think it's important for the world to know that what the United States is doing to help their societies, we do not do a good enough job of promoting what we have done historically and continue to do to help our fellow man around the world.
Yeah, China is spending $10 billion per year on that propaganda and misinformation operation. They celebrate when budgets get sent up to the Hill that propose big increases in military spending and giant decreases in the kind of tools that are available to you. So I do look forward to working with you to make sure that we've given you that full suite of tools necessary to confront our adversaries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Little bit of fact checking here. That $10 billion number that the senator referenced, that's an outdated number. That was a number that I think is at least 10 years old. We don't actually know the current number. That was when the Chinese were expanding their propaganda enterprise in places like Africa with CGTN, the headquarters in Nairobi. I don't think that number is anywhere near as high, and I don't think there's a lot of reliable data as to how much they are spending today. Also, just want to remind everybody that the United States as well engages in these types of practices. Don't forget, last June, Reuters uncovered that the Pentagon ran disinformation campaigns about Chinese vaccines in the Philippines. The Congress passed $1.6 billion in funding to mount disinformation campaigns against the Chinese in the global south and Africa and elsewhere. So this is a sandbox that has lots of players in it. And Cobus, we've talked about a lot on the past couple of years that the use of the debt trap narrative, which, by the way, did come up in this hearing, is a form of disinformation, given the fact that the front page of a Google search, the first page of a Google search on the Chinese debt trap, will bring up research by Deborah Browningham, by Chatham House, by Boston University, Johns Hopkins, Harvard University, that have all debunked it. And so that, as you've pointed out, is active disinformation by the United States. So the point here is just to kind of say that everybody is playing in this space. But disinformation, Cobus, a big topic.
Yeah, I mean, also, like all of the points that you pointed out, I think there's much less difference between the United States and China on this issue than either of them would pretend. But I think it's also...
Well, theirs is more institutionalized, I think, though. That is
the style is different.
I think there are some fundamental differences. I think that's not fair to compare. The United States does engage in it, but I think that it is more institutionalized in China with the state media apparatus.
Yeah, and which in some ways, again, this is a wide canvas, but I think what we've seen, like in the uses of some US social media platforms in Africa, have shown that like there's negative consequences on both sides. And I think the full retreat by companies like Meta from content moderation is strengthening that very much so. Like there's no way that misinformation won't increase because of the lack of content moderation. So in that sense, I think I can see why it's a talking point, but it's a very unconvincing talking point for me.
But let's not forget that Marco Rubio's future boss as of Monday is Donald Trump, who is not exactly a truth teller. He has a lot of difficulty managing the truth. Fonteh, when you hear this issue of disinformation come up in the context that we just heard between Rubio and Senator Murphy, what do you think? And again, you're going to be in this space in some places like South Africa where you're going to receive it from all sides. What's your reaction to that exchange?
My reaction to the conversation about misinformation and disinformation is it often misses the very architecture that has not only accelerated, but also cheapened misinformation and disinformation while making it more targeted to achieve a specific outcome, right? And we see exactly the impact of disinformation campaigns in places like the Central African Republic. And we've seen some campaigns in South Africa as well. So I agree with Cobus. It happens on both sides, but they're not having a conversation about exactly how to regulate, protect the privacy of tech users to ensure that their data is not mined for disinformation purposes. Maybe you should start there. Penalizing disinformation where there is effective investigation, I think that's a step that they could be talking about. Ensuring that there is clear regulation of the main tech companies, many of which operate from outside of Silicon Valley. They are not going to go there. So I think if you're going to have a conversation about misinformation and disinformation and deep fakes, the question of AI and the regulation of artificial intelligence has to be front and center, because we're seeing only the tip of the iceberg right now. It's going to get more complicated, and just playing games and accusing one or the other does not get us to a space where there is better regulation, there is better moderation, and there is penalization of these kinds of campaigns, which would always exist.
But isn't that really, at the end of the day, the burden of the South African government to create regulations to manage and moderate these discussions, not necessarily that of Silicon Valley?
Absolutely. Every government would have to play a role, right? But you're looking at the South African government, which has to contend with, say, a Google, whose global capital is almost 3 times the GDP of the South African government, for example. So there are clearly power dynamics involved here. Same with almost every African country having to deal with misinformation and disinformation within their spaces. However, in order to do that, there has to be a degree of cooperation globally as well, so that we set some minimum standards on information technology and the use of artificial intelligence.
I'd like to close our discussion about the hearings with a plea from Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, who I have heard many times make a similar plea for people in Washington, like Senator Rubio, to focus more attention on Africa.
We sat in my office recently. I told you about my concerns about Africa right now. Democratic Republican administrations have not prioritized the continent. It is literally the fastest growing continent on Earth. We now see the future. By 2050, 1 out of every 4 human beings on the planet will be in the continent of Africa. And because of the demographic issues we have around the globe, from Europe to the United States to even China, 1 out of every 3 working people on the planet will be in Africa. It is rich with arable land and critical minerals. It has an economic potential that could create tremendous markets for American companies and American businesses. More than this, we know, while it has incredible assets and opportunities, a lack of focus on Africa can endanger the whole planet. We know in the days of infectious diseases, for example, an outbreak of an infectious disease anywhere is a threat to public health everywhere. More than that, we see the climate challenges, migration patterns there threaten to destabilize the Middle East and other areas. Egypt, for example, literally is hosting millions of refugees in Egypt right now. Now, my frustrations in my 12 years here is that we as a nation have not really prioritized it. We do not have ambassadors in some countries where China and Russia, who understand the African opportunities, are investing heavily. I've gone around the world, and in my times in African countries, I often encounter people that saying, hey, the Chinese are here, where are you? And it's not just ambassadorial placements. Other critical positions in embassies just aren't being filled. And therefore, we're being outplayed by the Chinese and the Russians. African countries and leaders have told me time and time again, we prefer you. We'd rather deal with you. We'd rather work with you. And we can see by legal immigration patterns that their people would rather our way of life than the Chinese or the Russians. But we are simply being outplayed in ways that we can counter if we had a real focus and a real strategy for engaging Africa. And the impact of U.S. engagement is real. And the backbone of our diplomacy is that diplomat abroad, is that Secretary of State on down, people saying this is a priority. I said this to you in our office, and I want to make it plain now that we are at a point in this country that what we do in the Senate and in the White House and in the State Department are planting seeds for the future. We could reap a tremendous harvest in 10, 20 years, prioritizing and emphasizing our work in Africa. And not to do so undermines the 3 points that you said at the beginning that I agree. Our foreign policy should be guided by what makes us safe, strong, and prosperous. And the future, in so many ways, is Africa.
Fonteh, you're in Washington right now. Cobus and I were there last summer. I'm going back this summer. It is hard to have conversations about Africa in Washington. There's not a lot of people that are that interested in the topic. So when you hear the appeal from Senator Booker for Rubio to care more about this topic in this region, you're there now. How does this correspond to what you're experiencing?
Listen, Eric, Africa is not a priority out here, right? And even less so for the current administration. Of course, there are niche groups who are very dedicated to pushing the African agenda out here. But in many ways, I'm not optimistic about Africa rising on the priority list in Washington over the next 4 years. The first observation is there isn't sort of a clear understanding of which Africa to grapple with. And I was in conversations where you get questions like, so what Africa are we speaking to? Are we speaking to the heads of state? Are we speaking to African societies? What kinds of African societies? Are we speaking to the private sector? And my answer is often that the US has the capability to actually speak to all of these actors, right? But the bigger question is, what do you get from it? I mean, to what extent has the US, for a government, for example, taken up the second 10-year implementation window of Agenda 2063 to say, hey, we're going to work with this, similar to the way China reflected the second 10-year implementation window priorities in the latest FOCAC statement, right? It's just not happening. So I think African countries and the US would likely be talking past each other. There are potential areas where there could be common ground. Faith groups, for example, have quite a space within President Trump's constituency, and they have a foothold on the continent as well. So that could be a bridging point. There could be a bridging point on trade as well, although the Trump administration is likely to prefer bilateral trade engagements as opposed to engaging within the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. There's potential agreement as well on issues of security. As far as terrorism is concerned, there is also potential consensus and opportunity on issues relating to critical raw minerals, which we have spoken to, and the U.S. private sector would be critical in driving some of these engagements within the Trump administration. But like you heard during Senator Rubio's confirmation, there is an interest in exploiting critical raw minerals in Greenland. There is an interest in the South China Seas as a way of countering China. There is also an interest in resolving the situation in Venezuela, and the Middle East is up on the agenda. So in that maze of priorities, Africa seems to be a drop in the ocean.
Well, let's listen now to what Rubio and how he responded to Senator Booker's call for more attention to be focused on Africa.
Yeah, and I'll preface it by saying that obviously I'm not been confirmed yet. The president's not in office yet. There will be a national security strategy that will frame much of what we do in foreign policy. So what I'm going to share with you basically here today is, as someone who will be at that table, some of the impressions that I would share with regards to our historic involvement in Africa and also some of our challenges moving forward. So the first, and you've already highlighted all the things about the growth that's going to happen. They'll double in population between now and 2020, 35 or what have you. So it's extraordinary. That isn't just an interesting number. That's also markets. Those are also consumers. Those are also places that I think provide an extraordinary opportunity, properly positioned, for America to become more prosperous. Literally, more people that can afford to buy the things Americans provide, both in services and goods, and vice versa. So I think there's an extraordinary opportunity. Where I think some of our situation in Africa has fallen off it's been, and rightfully so, heavily focused on counterterrorism and solely on counterterrorism in some places. And that's valuable and important. It is very difficult for a country to progress or move forward if they are, in fact, a haven, for that's open. And so, the freaks come out at night and you've got the terrorist groups that are operating and undermining that country. So it's not that it's unimportant. I think we're also learning from the Sahel how quickly the situation changes. Despite significant counterterrorism contributions, each of those countries have pivoted to their great mistake, grave error, towards the Africa Corps led by Russia. These people are not any good at fighting counterterrorism and unreliable. And I think the moment will come when they'll realize that, and maybe there will be a new opportunity to engage. On the flip side of it, if you look at littoral West Africa, there are real opportunities there for, and in fact, ongoing engagements, not just on counterterrorism, but on economic progress. I look in the north to Morocco, another place where we have already seen substantial improvements because of the accords, but also because phase 2 of that relationship that continues to build. You also talk about one thing that I don't think has been talked about enough, and I think we hear the term as a 19th century term. The impact that malaria has is not simply a health crisis or humanitarian crisis. It has deep economic crisis, deep economic implications. It pulls kids out of school for long periods of time and not end their lives. It literally sets people and communities back. Humans and people are the greatest resource of any country. And the cost benefit of an investment, leveraging private partnerships to deal with things like malaria, pays extraordinary dividends if appropriately done and channeled. And that is something that I think could, as part of an overall approach to Africa, be included in things that you could argue are improving our prosperity, our security.
Cobus, there you have it. That is the Rubio worldview on Africa.
Obviously, greater investment in rolling out something like affordable malaria medication, which, as I understand it, is largely being held back, or exciting new medication, the rollout of that is largely being held back by drug companies, would be great. Obviously, there's a lot of space there. Overall, I think I'm in the same space as Fonteh in the sense that Africa has put out very significant and well-developed plan for what it wants to achieve. It's made progress along that route. There's a lot of space to work with Africa. You can spend a lot of time in Africa working with a lot of African stakeholders and not run into a single Russian or single Chinese. There's a lot of space to work with Africa for everyone. So nothing is holding them back. I think what ends up, holding a lot of this engagement back is what I've been calling over the last while is kind of Africa's kind of structural and also symbolic position in the global economy and the global imaginary, right? Kind of which is really summed up, for example, around the kind of phobia around African migration to Europe. So if one is, for example, interested in economic bridging between, Africa and the United States, there are Nigerian immigrants and, depending on their status, who regularly every year get into all of the Ivy League universities, for example, right? So it's simply increasing foreign student access for African students will make a huge difference already, but it's not being increased, right? Because Africa does remain kind of siloed in this kind of these very specific areas, which are all the areas that they were pointing out, military, disease, so on. So, again, there's no kind of surprise here. All of this is rote. And I have to admit, I don't think that Africa's position will necessarily change. And, I think the bigger question is whether they really are kind of realistic spaces for this kind of cooperation. Fonteh, I don't know, did you see the opportunity? There's all kinds of abstract opportunities for cooperation, but do you see actual areas where the US can simply step in on the 20th of January and start working with Africa in a different way?
First off, I think it's worth giving credit to the first Trump administration for pushing out an Africa strategy much earlier than most Democratic administrations have done. The second is, I get the sense, right, that the Trump administration is going to depend quite heavily on specific individuals to drive processes. And so, depending on the appropriations that are given to Africa, a person like Peter Palm would be a steady hand to actually drive specific initiatives on the continent. But of course, they would have to go through the confirmation processes as well. So it's not going to be on January 20th. However, that said, there would be a degree of continuity from where the Biden administration is going to leave off. And there's always been continuity and bipartisan consensus. The key sticking point at the moment is the renewal of AGOA, which is still pending and which consensus has basically been broken, right? And that's the reason why AGOA could not pass by the end of last year. So that's a point to watch. However, even if AGOA is not passed, I think it provides an opportunity to rethink Africa and US engagements in an age where there are 1.4 billion inhabitants. Africa's productive potential has changed from the time when AGOA was passed. So there's an opportunity really to rethink, reset, and recalibrate US relations with Africa. Whether that would happen, it depends on who is at the table or behind the desk at State Department, at the NSC, and at Defense on the Africa file.
And of course, if Peter Pham is named as Assistant Secretary, he is well known in senior policymaking circles in most African capitals. So to your point, he would be a very steady hand there, at least a well-known and familiar face to a lot of African policymakers and leaders as well. Just before we go and we wrap up this part of our discussion, I do want to mention that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs did respond on Thursday to Rubio's comments. Spokesperson Guo Jiakun was asked at the regular press briefing in Beijing to respond, and he said, quote, "The U.S. side must establish a correct understanding of China, cease unwarranted attacks and smear campaigns against China." That is the response by Guo Jiakun at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to all of this rhetoric that you heard over the past hour from Senator Marco Rubio. Gentlemen, just before we go, I just have to take advantage of your presence here today because there was a column in the Wall Street Journal today that really amped up the rhetoric against South Africa. There have been frustrations in Washington now for at least a year, probably going back further, that South Africa and the United States are not on the same page. This was written by two staff members at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is quite a provocative group, an interest group there in Washington. Mark Dubowitz and Elaine Dezensky wrote it. There's a paragraph that I wanted to read, and I thought instead of me reading it, it's more interesting if I use an AI text-to-speech generator. So let's take a listen to this quote from their column in the Wall Street Journal today, and I'd love to get your take on it.
Mr. Trump should seize this rare chance to halt South Africa's decline by delivering an ultimatum. The U.S. will support the country's growth through investments and diplomacy, but continued alignment with China, Russia, Iran, and Hamas will bring swift consequences. If the government persists with its reckless foreign policy, Mr. Trump should consider slashing American trade benefits, isolating Pretoria diplomatically, and imposing sanctions against ANC leaders that ally with America's adversaries and engage in corruption.
So the column was entitled, "South Africa Needs the Trump Treatment." This is a major escalation of rhetoric coming out of Washington. The FDD is an insider organization. I think this is something to take very seriously. Fonteh, when you hear, and I'm sure you've been in touch with South African officials in Washington as well, there is palpable concern about the current state of the relationship. When you hear this and you read this column from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and this very strong rhetoric of cutting off ties, isolating, sanctioning, what do you think?
I think there's a valid concern, right? But at the same time, it should not be a knee-jerk reaction because the potential since the emergence of the government of national unity for South Africa to actually pivot on a number of issues. There's also opportunity within South Africa's presidency of the G20, which precedes the US presidency of the G20, to provide a framework for South Africa and the US to kind of feel each other out diplomatically before any decisions are made. There are quite some South Africa hawks who are going to be part of the national security establishment in Washington, D.C. that's going to take over from January 20th. I think there is legitimate concern about the way things can go. However, either way, there are consequences for South Africa's actions as much as there will be consequences for U.S. actions against South Africa as well. So it's a wait and see. But I think if any decisions are going to be made, it would come after prolonged diplomatic engagement. So it would benefit the South African government as well to calibrate its engagement with the US and to deploy the requisite outreach to prevent any kind of punitive measures.
Cobus, I don't know if there's going to be that time. There is, to me, a feeling of exasperation in Washington about what's happening in South Africa and the tensions between Pretoria and Washington that to many people in Washington, it feels irreconcilable. Do you see a scenario where the United States isolates South Africa, cuts AGOA, penalizes South African leaderships the way that this column outlines? Is that a possibility?
I think it is possible. At the moment, I don't think it's that likely, but a lot will depend on this kind of diplomatic coordination that Fonteh was mentioning. I think South Africa, I agree that I think both South Africa can be more circumspect about how it positions itself, and I think it needs to try and kind of proactively try and sweeten the relationship with the United States. But I also think that there are certain really kind of fundamental issues involved that relate to South Africa's status as a global South country. So South Africa is a kind of a pivotal global South country in that sense. And, and we look through to all of this stuff through a lens of engagement between the African continent and China. And that is by definition both a kind of a big kind of tectonic megatrend that keeps kind of gathering speed over time, and one that really kind of highlights simply what the nature of Western power has been in Africa before. And, so the column frequently, like several times in the column, it references the Mandela legacy and frames the ANC as having stepped away from the Mandela legacy, which, sure, like I think many South Africans, would agree. But one should also keep in mind that the original people who sold out Mandela to the apartheid police force that arrested him was the CIA. Apartheid was defended by the Reagan administration literally up to like about 3 years before it basically fell down on its own. So apartheid didn't exist in isolation. And a lot of like the way that South Africa kind of acts as this kind of irritant has these bigger kind of like historical connections, like both to the past of Western power, but also to the future of rising non-Western powers, right? So in lots of ways, South Africa is this kind of microcosm of large global geopolitical shifts. And so in some ways, it's not surprising that South Africa is this kind of irritant. I think, though, that one has to be realistic and say that, sure, Russia gets thrown around a lot, but a lot of the stories about the specific operation has been debunked from the South African side, and the role that South Africa has played in the global controversies around Gaza cannot be underestimated in this case, I think.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, it's about Israel and Gaza. This is what pisses them off more than anything.
Yeah, South Africa is being punished because it embarrassed the United States on its stance on Gaza. I think that is part of the bigger context.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And if the Americans and the senators thought that they had a problem with critical mineral supply chains, putting South Africa in the penalty box and cutting off those supply chains and that trade between South Africa and the U.S. would set the United States back even further in being able to build rival supply chains outside of what China already controls.
And the thing is, there's no need to pick a big fight with South Africa. Like, one can sweeten the relationship with South Africa through diplomacy. And through diplomacy and business incentives would be much more effective. Kind of putting this kind of pressure on South Africa, because South Africa is a feisty country, right? Kind of like it always punches above its weight. So publicly shaming South Africa in this way will only force the government closer and closer to non-Western allies, right? Like, it's much more effective to sweeten South Africa kind of behind the scenes, and cheaper, I think.
Well, let's see who he names for the ambassador to South Africa. It's not been very encouraging. We already heard Politico was reporting that people are putting their names forward to become ambassadors in Africa because they want to do, and I'm not joking, this is from the Politico report, they want to go big game hunting. So I think that they're looking at posts in Africa with not a lot of seriousness. And remember that during Trump 1, the ambassador was a handbag maven, and so not a very effective ambassador. So it really depends on who gets put in that position. Fonteh, we have held you long enough during your last day in Washington. We are so grateful for your time and your insights on everything. We covered a lot of territory here. Just very quickly before you go, I'd just like to get one final thought from you about what you are telling folks back in Pretoria, and when African stakeholders come to you and say, Fonteh, you were just in Washington, what do we need to know? What are you telling them?
The first thing I would say is we need to think of Africa first. That seems very rhetorical, but indeed, solutions to Africa's problems are not really going to come through the United States. They would come through a diversification of partnerships. And we've got to look at the world as our stage and us as principal actors with a role to play in shaping our destiny.
That is a great way to end our discussion. Fonteh Akum is the executive director of the Institute for Security Studies, and we caught him on his last day in Washington. perfect timing for this discussion about U.S.-China-Africa relations. Fonteh, thank you so much for taking your time to join us today.
Thank you, Eric.
And that will leave it. Cobus, we will spare everybody our final thoughts, in part because we are already over time, and we don't like to do podcasts longer than an hour, but we had to have these long sound bites and to hear from Fonteh. So Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow all the discussions around these issues, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and we'd be thrilled for you to support the work that our team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are doing to create independent, fact-based, agenda-free journalism about Chinese engagement in Africa and around the world. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. And don't forget, if you are a student or a teacher, we'll give you 50% off because we know you guys don't have a lot of money. $10 subscriptions, even a student can afford that. Just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. So for Fonteh and for Cobus, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Bluesky and X at China GS Project, or on YouTube at China Global South, and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.